There was no charge by the State Department that the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan, since the troops apparently were invited. However, at a meeting with Soviet bloc ambassadors in October, Amin's foreign minister had openly criticized the Soviet Union for interfering in Afghan affairs. Amin himself insisted that Moscow replace its ambassador. Yet, on December 26th, while the main body of Soviet troops was arriving in Afghanistan, Amin gave a relaxed interview to an Arab journalist. "The Soviets," he said, "supply my country with economic and military aid, but at the same time they respect our independence and our sovereignty. They do not interfere in our domestic affairs." He also spoke approvingly of the USSR's willingness to accept his veto on military bases. The very next day, a Soviet military force stormed the presidential palace and shot Amin dead. He was replaced by Bubruk Karmal, who had been vice president and deputy prime minister in the 1978 revolutionary government. Moscow denied any part in Amin's death, though they didn't pretend to be sorry about it, as Brezhnev made clear. The actions of the aggressors against Afghanistan were facilitated by Amin, who, on seizing power, started cruelly repressing broad sections of Afghan society, party and military cadres, members of the intelligentsia and of the Muslim clergy, that is, the very sections on which the April Revolution relied. And the people under the leadership of the People's Democratic Party, headed by Bubruk Karmal, rose against Amin's tyranny and put an end to it. Now in Washington and some other capitals they are mourning Amin. This exposes their hypocrisy with particular clarity. Where were these mourners when Amin was conducting mass repressions, when he forcibly removed and unlawfully killed Taraki, the founder of the new Afghan state? After Amin's ouster and execution, the public thronged the streets in a holiday spirit. "If Karmal could have overthrown Amin without the Russians," observed a Western diplomat, "he would have been seen as a hero of the people." The Soviet government and press repeatedly referred to Amin as a CIA agent, a charge which was greeted with great skepticism in the United States and elsewhere. However, enough circumstantial evidence supporting the charge exists so that it perhaps should not be dismissed entirely out of hand. During the late 1950s and early 60s, Amin had attended Columbia University Teachers College and the University of Wisconsin. This was a heyday period for the CIA, using impressive bribes and threats to regularly try to recruit foreign students in the United States to act as agents for them when they returned home. During this period, at least one president of the Afghanistan Students Association, ASA, Zia H. Norzai, was working with the CIA in the United States and later became president of the Afghanistan State Treasury. One of the Afghan students whom Norzai and the CIA tried in vain to recruit, Abdul Latif Attaki, declared in 1967 that a good number of the key officials in the Afghanistan government who studied in the United States are either CIA trained or indoctrinated. Some are cabinet-level people. It has been reported that in 1963 Amin became head of the ASA, but this has not been corroborated. However, it is known that the ASA received part of its funding from the Asia Foundation, the CIA's principal front in Asia for many years, and that at one time Amin was associated with this organization. In September 1979, the month that Amin took power, the American charge d'affaires in Kabul, Bruce Amstutz, began to hold friendly meetings with him to reassure him that he need not worry about his unhappy Soviet allies as long as the US maintained a strong presence in Afghanistan. The strategy may have worked, for later in the month, Amin made a special appeal to Amstutz for improved relations with the United States. 2 days later in New York, the Afghan foreign minister quietly expressed the same sentiments to State Department officials. And at the end of October, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul reported that Amin was painfully aware of the exiled leadership the Soviets were keeping on the shelf, a reference to Karmal, who was living in Czechoslovakia. Under normal circumstances, the Amin-U.S. meetings might be regarded as routine and innocent diplomatic contact, but these were hardly normal circumstances. The Afghan government was engaged in a civil war, and the United States was supporting the other side. Moreover, it can be said that Amin, by his ruthlessness, was doing just what an American agent would be expected to do, discrediting the People's Democratic Party, the party's reforms, the idea of socialism or communism, and the Soviet Union, all associated in one package. Amin also conducted purges in the Army Officer Corps, which seriously undermined the Army's combat capabilities. But why would Amin, if he were actually plotting with the Americans, request Soviet military forces on several occasions? The main reason appears to be that he was being pressed to do so by high levels of the PDP, and he had to comply for the sake of appearances. Bubra Karmal has suggested other, more Machiavellian scenarios. The Carter administration jumped on the issue of the Soviet invasion and soon launched a campaign of righteous indignation, imposing what President Carter called penalties, from halting the delivery of grain to the Soviet Union to keeping the US team out of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. The Russians countered that the US was enraged by the intervention because Washington had been plotting to turn the country into an American base to replace the loss of Iran. Unsurprisingly, on this seemingly clear-cut anti-communist issue, the American public and media easily fell in line with the president. The Wall Street Journal called for a military reaction, the establishment of US bases in the Middle East, reinstatement of draft registration, development of a new missile, and giving the CIA more leeway, adding, "Clearly we ought to keep open the chance of covert aid to Afghan rebels." The last, whether the newspaper knew it or not, had actually been going on for some time. For some period prior to the Soviet invasion, the CIA had been beaming radio propaganda into Afghanistan and cultivating alliances with exiled Afghan guerrilla leaders by donating medicine and communications equipment. US Foreign Service officers had been meeting with Mujahideen leaders to determine their needs at least as early as April 1979. And in July, President Carter had signed a finding to aid the rebels covertly, which led to the United States providing them with cash, weapons, equipment and supplies, and engaging in propaganda and other psychological operations in Afghanistan on their behalf. Intervention in the Afghan Civil War by the United States, Iran, Pakistan, China, and others gave the Russians grave concern about who was going to wield power next door. They consistently cited these aggressive imperialist forces to rationalize their own intervention into Afghanistan, which was the first time Soviet ground troops had engaged in military action anywhere in the world outside its post-World War II Eastern European borders. The potential establishment of an anti-communist Islamic state on the borders of the Soviet Union's own republics in Soviet Central Asia that were home to some 40 million Muslims could not be regarded with equanimity by the Kremlin any more than Washington could be unruffled about a communist takeover in Mexico. As we have seen repeatedly, the United States did not limit its defense perimeter to its immediate neighbors, or even to Western Europe, but to the entire globe. President Carter declared that the Persian Gulf area was now threatened by Soviet troops in Afghanistan, that this area was synonymous with US interests, and that the United States would defend it against any threat by all means necessary. He called the Soviet action the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War, a statement that required overlooking a great deal of post-war history. But 1980 was an election year. Brezhnev, on the other hand, declared that the national interests or security of the United States of America and other states are in no way affected by the events in Afghanistan. All attempts to portray matters otherwise are sheer nonsense. The Carter administration was equally dismissive of Soviet concerns. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski later stated that the issue was not what might have been Brezhnev's subjective motives in going into Afghanistan, but the objective consequences of a Soviet military presence so much closer to the Persian Gulf. The stage was now set for 12 long years of the most horrific kind of warfare, a daily atrocity for the vast majority of the Afghan people who never asked for or wanted this war. But the Soviet Union was determined that its borders must be unthreatening. The Afghan government was committed to its goal of a secular, reformed Afghanistan, and the United States was intent upon making this the Soviets' Vietnam, slowly bleeding as the Americans had. At the same time, American policymakers could not fail to understand, though they dared not say it publicly and explicitly, that support of the Mujahideen, many of whom carried pictures of the Ayatollah Khomeini with them, could lead to a fundamentalist Islamic state being established in Afghanistan every bit as repressive as in next-door Iran, which in the 1980s was public enemy number one in America. Neither could the word terrorist cross the lips of Washington officials in speaking of their new allies/clients, though these same people shot down civilian airliners and planted bombs at the airport. In 1986, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, whose emotional invectives against terrorists were second to none, welcomed Abdul Haq, an Afghan rebel leader who admitted that he had ordered the planting of a bomb at Kabul airport in 1984 which killed at least 28 people. Such, then, were the scruples of Cold War anti-communists in late 20th century. As Anastasio Somoza had been our son of a bitch The Mujahideen were now our fanatic terrorists. At the beginning, there had been some thought given to the morality of the policy. The question here, a senior official in the Carter administration said, was whether it was morally acceptable that, in order to keep the Soviets off balance, which was the reason for the operation, it was permissible to use other lives for our geopolitical interests. But such sentiments could not survive. Afghanistan was a Cold Warrior's dream. The CIA and the Pentagon finally had one of their proxy armies in direct confrontation with the forces of the evil empire. There was no price too high to pay for this Super Nintendo game, neither the hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives, nor the destruction of Afghan society, nor $3 billion dollars of American taxpayer money poured into a bottomless hole, much of it going only to make a few Afghans and Pakistanis rich. Congress was equally enthused, without even the moral uncertainty that made them cautious about arming the Nicaraguan Contras, and became a veritable bipartisan horn of plenty as it allocated more and more money for the effort each year. Then, Charles Wilson of Texas expressed a not atypical sentiment of official Washington when he declared, "There were 58,000 dead in Vietnam and we owe the Russians one. I have a slight obsession with it because of Vietnam. I thought the Soviets ought to get a dose of it. I've been of the opinion that this money was better spent to hurt our adversaries than other money in the Defense Department budget." The CIA became the grand coordinator, purchasing or arranging the manufacture of Soviet-style weapons from Egypt, China, Poland, Israel, and elsewhere, or supplying their own, arranging for military training by Americans, Egyptians, Chinese, and Iranians, hitting up Middle Eastern countries for donations, notably Saudi Arabia, which gave many hundreds of millions of dollars in aid each year, totaling probably more than $1 billion, pressuring and bribing Pakistan, with whom recent American relations had been very poor, to rent out its country as a military staging area and sanctuary, putting the Pakistani director of military operations, Brigadier Mian Muhammad Afzal, onto the CIA payroll to ensure Pakistani cooperation. Military and economic aid which had been cut off would be restored, Pakistan was told by the United States, if they would join the Great Crusade. Only a month before the Soviet intervention, anti-American mobs had burned and ransacked the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad and American cultural centers in 2 other Pakistani cities. The American ambassador in Libya reported that Muammar Gaddafi was sending the rebels $250,000 as well, but this, presumably, was not at the request of the CIA. Washington left it to the Pakistanis to decide which of the various Afghan guerrilla groups should be the beneficiaries of much of this largesse. As one observer put it, according to conventional wisdom at the time, the United States would not repeat the mistake of Vietnam, micromanaging a war in a culture it did not understand. Not everyone in Pakistan was bought out. The independent Islamabad daily newspaper, The Muslim, more than once accused the United States of being ready to fight to the last Afghan. We are not flattered to be termed a frontline state by Washington. Washington does not seem to be in any mood to seek an early settlement of a war whose benefits it is reaping at no cost of American manpower. It's not actually clear whether there was any loss of American lives in the war. On several occasions in the late 80s, the Kabul government announced that Americans had been killed in the fighting, and in 1985 a London newspaper reported that some 24 American black Muslims were in Afghanistan, fighting alongside the Mujahideen in a jihad that a fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran says all believers in Islam must do at least once in their lives. Several of the black Muslims returned to the United States after being wounded. Soviet aggression, Soviet invasion, Soviet swallowing up another innocent state as part of their plan to conquer the world, or at least the Middle East. This was the predominant and lasting lesson taught by Washington official pronouncements and the mainstream U.S. media about the war, and the sum total of knowledge for the average American, although Afghanistan had retained its independence during 60 years of living in peace next door to the Soviet Union. Zbigniew Brzezinski, albeit unrelentingly anti-Soviet, repeatedly speaks of the fact of Afghanistan's neutrality in his memoirs. The country had been neutral even during the Second World War. One would have to look long and hard at the information and rhetoric offered to the American public following the Soviet intervention to derive even a hint that the Civil War was essentially a struggle over deep-seated social reform, while an actual discussion of the issue was virtually non-existent. Prior to the intervention, one could get a taste of this, such as the following from the New York Times: "Land reform attempts undermined their village chiefs." Portraits of Lenin threatened their religious leaders. But it was the Kabul revolutionary government's granting of new rights to women that pushed Orthodox Muslim men in the Pashtun villages of eastern Afghanistan into picking up their guns. The government said our women had to attend meetings and our children had to go to schools. This threatens our religion. We had to fight. The government imposed various ordinances allowing women freedom to marry anyone they chose without their parents' consent. Throughout the 1980s, the Karmel and then the Najibullah regimes, despite the exigencies of the war, pursued a program of modernization and broadening of their base. Bringing electricity to villages along with health clinics, a measure of land reform and literacy. Releasing numerous prisoners unlawfully incarcerated by Amin. Bringing mullahs and other non-party people into the government. Trying to carry it all out with moderation and sensitivity instead of confronting the traditional structures head-on. Reiterating its commitment to Islam, rebuilding and constructing mosques, exempting land owned by religious dignitaries and their institutions from land reform. Trying, in short, to avoid the gross mistakes of the Amin government with its rush to force changes down people's throats. Selig Harrison, writing in 1988, stated, "The Afghan communists see themselves as nationalists and modernizers. They rationalize their collaboration with the Russians as the only way available to consolidate their revolution in the face of foreign interference. The commitment of the communists to rapid modernization enables them to win a grudging tolerance from many members of the modern-minded middle class, who feel trapped between two fires, the Russians and fanatic Muslims opposed to social reforms. The program of the Kabul government eventually encouraged many volunteers to take up arms in its name. But it was a decidedly uphill fight, for it was relatively easy for the native anti-reformists and their foreign backers to convince large numbers of ordinary peasants that the government had ill intentions by blurring the distinction between the present government and its detested and dogmatic predecessor, particularly since the government was fond of stressing the continuity of the April 1978 revolution. One thing the peasants, as well as the anti-reformists, were undoubtedly not told of was the U.S. connection to the selfsame detested predecessor, Hafizullah Amin. Another problem faced by the Kabul government in winning the hearts and minds of the people was of course the continuing Soviet armed presence, although it must be remembered that Islamic opposition to the leftist government began well before the Soviet forces arrived. Indeed, the most militant of the Mujahideen leaders, Hekmatyar, had led a serious uprising against the previous, non-leftist government as well, in 1975, declaring that a godless, communist-dominated regime ruled in Kabul. As long as Soviet troops remained, the conflict in Afghanistan could be presented to the American mind as little more than a battle between Russian invaders and Afghanistan resistance/freedom fighters, as if the Afghanistan army and government didn't exist, or certainly not with a large following of people who favored reforms and didn't want to live under a fundamentalist Islamic government, probably a majority of the population. Maybe the people really don't like us either, said Muhammad Hakim, mayor of Kabul, a general in the Afghan army who was trained in the 1970s at military bases in the United States, and who thought that America was the best country. But they like us better than the extremists. This is what the Western countries do not understand. We only hope that Mr. Bush and the people of the United States take a good look at us. They think we are very fanatic communists, that we are not human beings. We are not fanatics. We are not even communists. They were in the American media. Any official of the Afghan government or the government as a whole was typically referred to a priori as communist or Marxist or pro-communist or pro-Marxist, etc., without explanation or definition. Najibullah, who took over when Karmel stepped down in 1986, was confirmed in his position in 1987 under a new Islamized constitution that was stripped of all socialist rhetoric and brimming with references to Islam and the Holy Quran. "This is not a socialist revolutionary country," he said in his acceptance speech. "We do not want to build a communist society. Could the United States see beyond Cold War ideology and consider the needs of the Afghan people?" In August 1979, 3 months before the Soviet intervention, a classified State Department report stated, "The United States' larger interests would be served by the demise of the Turaki Amin regime, despite whatever setbacks this might mean for future social and economic reforms in Afghanistan. The overthrow of the DRA, Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, would show the rest of the world, particularly the Third World, that the Soviets' view of the socialist course of history as being inevitable is not accurate. Repeatedly, in the 1980s, as earlier, the Soviet Union contended that no solution to the conflict could be found until the United States and other nations ceased their support of the Mujahideen. The United States, in turn, insisted that the Soviets must first withdraw their troops from Afghanistan. Finally, after several years of UN-supported negotiations, an accord was signed in Geneva on April 14, 1988, under which the Kremlin committed itself to begin pulling out its estimated 115,000 troops on May 15th, and to complete the process by February 15th of the next year. Afghanistan, said Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, had become a bleeding wound. In February, after the last Soviet forces had left Afghanistan, Gorbachev urged the United States to support an embargo on arms shipments into Afghanistan and a ceasefire between the two warring sides. Both proposals were turned down by the new Bush administration, which claimed that the Afghan government had been left with a massive stockpile of military equipment. It is unclear why Washington felt that the rebels who had fought the government to a standstill despite the powerful presence of the Soviet armed forces with all their equipment would now be at a dangerous disadvantage with the Russians gone. The key to the American response may lie in the State Department statement of the prior week that the United States believed that the Kabul government on its own would not last more than 6 months. By raising the question of an arms gap, whether it was for real or not, Washington was assuring the continuation of the arms race in Afghanistan, a microcosm of the Cold War. At the same time, the Bush administration called upon the Soviets to support an independent, non-aligned Afghanistan, although this was precisely what the United States had worked for decades to thwart. 2 days later, President Najibullah criticized the American rejection of Gorbachev's proposal, offering to return the Soviet weapons if the rebels agreed to lay down their weapons and negotiate. There was no reported response to this offer from the US or from the rebels, who in the past had refused such offers. It would appear that Washington was thinking longer term than ceasefires and negotiations. On the same day as Najibullah's offer, the United States announced that it had delivered 500,000 Made in America textbooks to Afghanistan, which were being used to teach grades 1 through 4. The books, which critics say bordered on propaganda, told of the rebels' fight against the Soviet Union and contained drawings of guerrillas killing Russian soldiers. Since the beginning of the war, the Mujahideen had reserved its worst treatment for Russians. Washington possessed confirmed reports that the rebels had drugged and tortured 50 to 200 Soviet prisoners and imprisoned them like animals in cages, living lives of indescribable horror. Another account, by a reporter from the conservative Far Eastern Economic Review, relates that one Soviet group was killed, skinned and hung up in a butcher's shop. One captive found himself the center of attraction in a game of buzkashi, that rough and tumble form of Afghan polo in which a headless goat is usually the ball. The captive was used instead. Alive. He was literally torn to pieces. Meanwhile, much to the surprise of the United States and everyone else, the Kabul government showed no sign of collapsing. The good news for Washington was that since the Soviet troops were gone, though some military advisors remained, the cost-benefit ratio had improved, the cost being measured entirely in non-American deaths and suffering, as the rebels regularly exploded car bombs and sent rockets smashing into residential areas of Kabul, and destroyed government-built schools and clinics and murdered literacy teachers, just as the US-backed Nicaraguan Contras had been doing on the other side of the world. And for the same reason, these were symbols of governmental benevolence. The death and destruction caused by the Soviets and their Afghan allies was also extensive, such as the many bombings of villages. But individual atrocity stories must be approached with caution, for, as we have seen repeatedly, the propensity and the ability of the CIA to disseminate anti-communist disinformation, often of the most far-fetched variety, was virtually unlimited. With the Soviet Union the direct adversary, the creativity lamp must have burning all night at Langley. Amnesty International, with its usual careful collection methods, reported in the mid-80s on the frequent use of torture and arbitrary detention by the authorities in Kabul. But what are we to make, for example, of the report without attribution by syndicated columnist Jack Anderson, who had ties to the American-Afghan lobby, that Soviet troops often marched into unfriendly villages in Afghanistan and massacred every man, woman, and child? Or the New York Times recounting a story told them by an Afghan citizen of how Afghan soldiers had intentionally blinded 5 children with pieces of metal and then strangled them. As a government supporter he was with just laughed. To the newspaper's credit, it added that there is no way of confirming this story. It is possible that the man who told it was acting and trying to discredit the regime here. His eyes, however, looked like they had seen horror. Or a US congressman's charge in 1985 that the Soviets had used booby-trap toys to maim Afghan children. The identical story told before about leftists elsewhere in the world during the Cold War, and repeated again in 1987 by CBS News with pictures. The New York Post later reported the claim of a BBC producer that the bomb toy had been created for the CBS cameraman. Then there was the Afghan Mercy Fund, ostensibly a relief agency, but primarily in the propaganda business, which reported that the Soviets had burned a baby alive, that they were disguising mines as candy bars and leaving other mines disguised as butterflies to also attract children. The butterfly mines, it turned out, were copies of a US-designed mine used in the Vietnam War. There was also the shooting down of a Pakistan fighter plane over Afghanistan in May 1987 that was reported by Pakistan and Washington, knowing with certainty that their claim was untrue, to be the result of a Soviet-made missile. It turned out that the plane had been shot down by a companion Pakistani plane in error. Throughout the early and mid-80s, the Reagan administration declared that the Russians were spraying toxic chemicals over Laos, Cambodia, and Afghanistan, the so-called Yellow Rain, and had caused more than 10,000 deaths by 1982 alone, including, in Afghanistan, 3,042 deaths attributed to 47 separate incidents between the summer of 1979 and the summer of 1981. So precise was the information. Secretary of State Alexander Haig was a prime dispenser of such stories, and President Reagan himself denounced the Soviet Union thusly more than 15 times in documents and speeches. The Yellow Rain, it turned out, was pollen-laden feces dropped by huge swarms of honeybees flying far overhead. Then, in 1987, it was disclosed that the Reagan administration had made its accusations even though government scientists at the time had been unable to confirm any of them, and considered the evidence to be flimsy and misleading. Even more suspicious, the major scientific studies that later examined Washington's claims spoke only of Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. No mention at all was made of Afghanistan. It was as if the administration, perhaps honestly mistaken at first about Indochina, had added Afghanistan to the list with full knowledge of the falsity of its allegation. Such disinformation campaigns are often designed to serve a domestic political need. Consider Senator Robert Dole's contribution to the discussion when he spoke in 1980 on the floor of Congress of convincing evidence he had been provided that the Soviets had developed a chemical capability that extends far beyond our greatest fears, a gas that is unaffected by our gas masks and leaves our military defenseless. He then added, to even suggest a leveling off of defense spending for our nation by the Carter administration at such a critical time in our history is unfathomable. And in March 1982, when the Reagan administration made its claim about the 3,042 Afghan deaths, the New York Times noted that President Reagan has just decided that the United States will resume production of chemical weapons and has asked for a substantial increase in the military budget for such weapons. The money needed to extend American propaganda campaigns internationally flowed from the Congressional Horn of Plenty as smoothly as for military desires. $500,000 in one moment's flow to train Afghan journalists to use television, radio, and newspapers to advance their cause. It should be noted that in June 1980, before any of the Yellow Rain charges had been made against the Soviet Union, the Kabul government had accused the rebels and their foreign backers of employing poison gas, citing an incident in which 500 pupils and teachers at several secondary schools had been poisoned with noxious gases. None were reported to have died. One reason victory continued to elude the Mujahideen was that they were terribly split by centuries-old ethnic and tribal divisions, as well as the relatively recent rise of Islamic fundamentalism in conflict with more traditional, but still orthodox, Islam. The differences often led to violence. In one incident in 1989, 7 top Mujahideen commanders and more than 20 other rebels were murdered by a rival guerrilla group. This was neither the first nor the last of such occurrences. By April 1990, 14 months after the Soviet withdrawal, the Los Angeles Times described the state of the rebels thusly: they have in recent weeks killed more of their own than the enemy. Rival resistance commanders have been gunned down gangland style here in the border town of Peshawar, Pakistan, the staging area for the war. There are persistent reports of large-scale political killings in the refugee camps. A recent execution had as much to do with drugs as with politics. Other commanders in Afghanistan and in the border camps are simply refusing to fight. They say privately that they prefer Afghan President Najibullah to the hardline Mujahideen fundamentalists led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. The rebel cause was also corrupted by the huge amounts of arms flooding in. Investigative reporter Tim Weiner reported the following. The CIA's pipeline leaked. It leaked badly. It spilled huge quantities of weapons all over one of the world's most anarchic areas. First, the Pakistani armed forces took what they wanted from the weapons shipments. Then corrupt Afghan guerrilla leaders stole and sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of anti-aircraft guns, missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, AK-47 automatic rifles, ammunition and mines from the CIA's arsenal. Some of the weapons fell into the hands of criminal gangs, heroin kingpins, and the most radical faction of the Iranian military. While their troops eked out hard lives in Afghanistan's mountains and deserts, the guerrillas' political leaders maintained fine villas in Peshawar and fleets of vehicles at their command. The CIA kept silent as the Afghan politicos converted the agency's weapons into cash. Amongst the weapons the Mujahideen sold to the Iranians were highly sophisticated Stinger heat-seeking anti-aircraft missiles, with which the rebels had shot down many hundreds of Soviet military aircraft, as well as at least 8 passenger planes. On October 8, 1987, Revolutionary Guards on an Iranian gunboat fired one of the Stingers at American helicopters patrolling the Persian Gulf, but missed their target. Earlier the same year, the CIA told Congress that at least 20% of its military aid to the Mujahideen had been skimmed off by the rebels and Pakistani officials. Columnist Jack Anderson stated at the same time that his conservative estimate was that the diversion was around 60%, while one rebel leader told Anderson's assistant on his visit to the border that he doubted that even 25% of the arms got through. By other accounts, as little as 20% was making it to the intended recipients. If indeed there was a deficiency of arms available to the Mujahideen compared to the government forces, as George Bush implied, this was clearly a major reason for it. Yet the CIA and other administration officials simply looked upon it as part of doing business in that part of the world. Like many other CIA clients, the rebels were financed as well through drug trafficking, and the agency was apparently as little concerned about it as ever as long as it kept their boys happy. Mujahideen commanders inside Afghanistan personally controlled huge fields of opium poppies, the raw material from which heroin is refined. CIA supplied trucks and mules, which had carried arms into Afghanistan, were used to transport some of the opium to the numerous laboratories along the Afghan-Pakistan border, whence many tons of heroin were processed with the cooperation of the Pakistani military. The output provided an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the heroin used annually in the United States and 3/4 of that used in Western Europe. U.S. officials admitted in 1990 that they had failed to investigate or take action against the drug operation because of a desire not to offend their Pakistani and Afghan allies. In 1993, an official of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration called Afghanistan the New Columbia of the drug world. The war, with all its torment, continued until the spring of 1992, 3 years after the last Soviet troops had gone. An agreement on ending the arms supply, which had been reached between the United States and the Soviet Union, was now in effect. The two superpowers had abandoned the war. The Soviet Union no longer existed, and the Afghan people could count more than 1 million dead, 3 million disabled, and 5 million made refugees, in total about half the population. At the same time, a UN-brokered truce was to transfer power to a transitional coalition government pending elections. But this was not to be. The Kabul government, amidst food riots and army revolts, virtually disintegrated, and the guerrillas stormed into the capital and established the first Islamic regime in Afghanistan, since it had become a separate and independent country in the mid-18th century. A key event in the downfall of the government was the 11th hour defection to the guerrillas of General Abdul Rashid Dostum. Dostum, who previously had been referred to in the US media as a communist general, now metamorphosed into an ex-communist general. The Mujahideen had won. Now they turned against each other with all their fury. Rockets and artillery shells wiped out entire neighborhoods in Kabul. By August, at least 1,500 people had been killed or wounded, mostly civilians. By 1994, the body count in this second civil war would reach 10,000. Of all the rebel leaders, none was less compromising or more insistent upon a military solution than Gabuddin Hekmatyar. Robert Newman, a former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, observed at this time, "Hekmatyar is a nut, an extremist and a very violent man. He was built up by the Pakistanis. Unfortunately, our government went along with the Pakistanis. We were supplying the money and the weapons, but the Pakistani officials were making the policy." Washington was now very concerned that Hekmatyar would take power. Ironically, they were afraid that if he did, his brand of extremism would spread to and destabilize the former Soviet republics of large Muslim populations, the same fear which had been one of the motivations behind the Soviets intervening in the Civil War in the first place. It was to the forces of Hekmatyar that the communist General Dostum eventually aligned himself. Suleiman Layek, a leftist and a poet, and the fallen regime's ideologue, watched from his window as the Mujahideen swarmed through the city, claiming building after building. "Without exception," he said of them, "they follow the way of the fundamentalist aims and goals of Islam. And it is not Islam. It is a kind of theory against civilization, against modern civilization." Even before taking power, the Mujahideen had banned all non-Muslim groups. Now more of the new law was laid down. All alcohol was banned in the Islamic Republic. Women could not venture out in the streets without veils, and violations would be punished by floggings, amputations, and public executions. And this from the more moderate Islamics, not Hekmatyar. By September, the first public hangings were carried out. Before a cheering crowd of 10,000 people, 3 men were hung. They had been tried behind closed doors, and no one would say what crimes they had committed. In February 1993, a group of Middle Easterners caused a powerful explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City. Most of them were veterans of the Mujahideen. Other veterans were carrying out assassinations in Cairo, bombings in Bombay, bloody uprisings in the mountains of Kashmir, and guerrilla warfare in the Philippines. This, then, was the power and the glory of President Reagan's freedom fighters, who had become yet more anti-American in recent years, many of them backing Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein in the Persian Gulf conflict of 1990 to 91. Surely even Ronald Reagan and George Bush would have preferred the company of communist reformers like President Noor Mohammad Taraki, Mayor Muhammad Hakim, or poet Suleiman Layek. But the Soviet Union had bled. It had bled profusely. For the United States, it had also been a holy war. 54. El Salvador 1980 a 1994. Human rights, Washington style. The United States was supporting the government of El Salvador, said President Ronald Reagan, because it was trying to halt the infiltration into the Americas by terrorists and by outside interference, and those who aren't just aiming at El Salvador, but I think are aiming at the whole of Central and possibly later South America, and I'm sure eventually North America. Psychiatrists have a term for such perceptions of reality. They call it paranoid schizophrenia. If the insurgents in El Salvador, the smallest country by far in all of Central and South America, were engaged in what Ronald Reagan perceived as a plot to capture the Western Hemisphere, others saw it as the quintessential revolution. Viewed in the latter context, it cannot be asserted that the Salvadorian people rushed precipitously into revolution at the first painful sting of repression, or turned to the gun because of a proclivity towards violent solutions, or a refusal to work within the system, or because of outside agitators, or any of the other explanations of why people revolt so dear to the hearts of Washington opinion makers. For as long as anyone could remember, the reins of El Salvador's government had resided in the hands of one military dictatorship or another, while the economy had been controlled by the celebrated 14 coffee and industrial families, with only the occasional, short-lived bursting of accumulated discontent to disturb the neat arrangement. In December 1980, New York Times, reporter Raymond Bonner asked José Napoleon Duarte why the guerrillas were in the hills. Duarte, who had just become president of the ruling junta, responded with an answer that surprised Bonner. 50 years of lies, 50 years of injustice, 50 years of frustration. This is a history of people starving to death, living in misery. For 50 years, the same people had all the power, all the money, all the jobs, all the education, all the opportunities. In the decades following the famed Peasant Rebellion in 1932, which was crushed by an unholy massacre, a reform government had occupied the political stage only twice. For 9 months in 1944, then again in 1960. The latter instance was precipitated by several thousand students of the National University who staged a protest against the curtailment of civil liberties. The government responded by sending in the police, who systematically smashed offices, classrooms, and laboratories, beat up the school's president, killed a librarian, bayoneted students, and raped dozens of young women. Finally, when the students amassed anew, troops opened fire upon them point blank. The bloody incident was one of the turning points for a group of junior military officers. They staged a coup in October aimed at major social and political reforms, but the new government lasted only 3 months before being overthrown in a counter-coup which the United States was reportedly involved in. Dr. Fabio Castillo, a former president of the National University and a member of the ousted government, testified years later before the U.S. Congress that in the process of overthrowing the reform government, the American embassy immediately began to intervene directly, and members of the U.S. military mission openly intensified their invitation to conspiracy and rebellion. Throughout the 1960s, multifarious American experts occupied themselves in El Salvador by enlarging and refining the state's security and counterinsurgency apparatus. The police, the National Guard, the military, the communications and intelligence networks, the coordination with their counterparts in other Central American countries. As matters turned out, these were the forces and resources which were brought into action to impose widespread repression and wage war. Years later, the New York Times noted, in El Salvador, American aid was used for police training in the 1950s and 1960s, and many officers in the 3 branches of the police later became leaders of the right-wing death squads that killed tens of thousands of people in the late 1970s and early 1980s. If during the 1960s, the apparatus could not be charged with the level of murder or torture or disappearance of political opponents reached in Guatemala and elsewhere in Latin America, it had more to do with the modest degree of outspoken dissent and violent unrest it faced than with greater respect for human rights. Those opposition groups which were not outlawed were those regarded as unthreatening. The bloated stomachs of malnourished peasant children were not regarded as threatening at all, for apparently no better reason than the fact that even militarists cherish a veneer of legitimacy. During the 1960s, certain political organizations of generally urban middle-class membership were allowed to run candidates for municipal and legislative office. They did well, though the government-calculated returns consistently left the opposition as a minority in the legislature, i.e., without real power. In 1967, the government went through the motions of the first contested election for the presidency since 1931. After declaring its party, PCN, the winner, the government promptly banned one of the major contending parties, PAR, on the grounds that it supported principles contrary to the Constitution. According to a PAR spokesperson, the principle involved was support for agrarian reform. Another source reports that the party was declared illegal allegedly for dispensing communist ideologies, which, within the government's frame of reference, may well have been one and the same. Undeterred, a center-left coalition, UNO by acronym, was formed and put forth Christian Democrat José Napoleon Duarte as its presidential candidate in 1972. Though UNO was confronted by violence against its candidates and campaigners, including the murder of an aide of Duarte and the sabotaging of the coalition's radio broadcasts, it arrived at election day with high expectations. 2 days after the polling, the Central Election Board, after first announcing a victory for PCN, shocked everyone by declaring that a recount had shown UNO to be the winner instead. The government quickly imposed a news blackout, and for the next 2 days nothing was heard concerning the election results. On the 3rd day, the election board announced that PCN was indeed the winner after all. In the 1974 and 1976 legislative elections, and again in the 1977 presidential election, the government employed similar creative counting along with gross physical intimidation of candidates, voters, and poll watchers to assure its continuance in office. A mass demonstration following the 1977 polling, protesting against electoral fraud, was surrounded by government security forces who opened fire. The result was nothing less than a bloodbath, the death toll measurable in the hundreds. In the immediate aftermath, Top leaders of UNO were exiled, and the party's followers became liable to arrest, torture, and murder. The country's president, Colonel Arturo Molina, blamed the protests on foreign communists. His response to charges of electoral fraud was, "Only God is perfect." Government political violence of this sort had been sporadic in the 1960s, but became commonplace in the 1970s as more and more Salvadorians, frustrated by the futility of achieving social change through elections, resorted to other means. While some limited themselves to more militant demonstrations, strikes, and occupations of sites, an increasing number turned to acts of urban guerrilla warfare, such as assassination of individuals seen as part of the repressive machinery, bombings, and kidnappings for ransom. The government and its paramilitary right-wing vigilante groups, death squads, is the self-named modern genre, countered with a campaign centered upon leaders of labor unions, peasant organizations, and political parties, as well as priests and lay religious workers. "Be patriotic, kill a priest" was the slogan of one death squad. Church people were accused of teaching subversion to the peasants, what the church people themselves would call the Word of God, in this the only country in the world named after Christ. The CIA and the US military played an essential role in the conception and organization of the security agencies from which the death squads emanated. CIA surveillance programs routinely supplied these agencies with information on and the whereabouts of various individuals who wound up as death squad victims. In October 1979, a cabal of younger military officers, repelled by the frequent government massacres of groups of protesters and strikers, and wishing to restore the military's good name, ousted General Carlos Romero from the presidency and took power in a bloodless coup. A number of prominent civilian political figures were given positions in the new administration, which proclaimed an impressive program of reforms. But it was not to be. The young and politically inexperienced officers were easily co-opted by older, conservative officers and by pressure exerted by the United States to install certain military men into key positions. The civilian members of the government found themselves unable to exercise any control over the armed forces and were left to function only as reformist camouflage. Washington had supported the removal of the brutal Romero because only 3 months earlier the Sandinistas had overthrown the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua, and the Carter administration did not wish to risk the loss of a second client state in Central America in so short a space of time, but brakes had to be applied to keep the process within manageable bounds. Meanwhile, the security forces did not miss a beat as they continued to fire into crowds. The body count in the first month of the reformist government was greater than in the first 9 months of the year. By January 1980, almost all the civilian members had resigned in disgust over government as usual. The experience was the straw which broke the backs of many moderates and liberals, as well as members of the Salvadorian Communist Party, who still clung to hopes of peaceful reforms. The Communist Party had supported the new government, even contributed the Minister of Labor, because we believe it is going to comply with its promises and open the possibility of democratizing the country. The party was the last group on the left to join the guerrilla forces. One of the civilians, Minister of Education Salvador Semeoa, in front of the TV cameras, simultaneously announced his resignation and his enlistment with a guerrilla group. For those who continued to harbor illusions, a steady drumbeat of terrorism soon brought them into the fold. A demonstration march by a coalition of popular organizations on January 22nd was first sprayed with DDT by crop duster planes along the route of the march. Then, when the demonstrators reached San Salvador's Central Plaza, snipers fired at them from surrounding government buildings. At least 21 dead and 120 seriously wounded was the toll, some of which reportedly resulted from the demonstrators' undisciplined return of fire. On March 17th, a general strike was met by retaliatory violence. 54 people killed in the capital alone. A week later, the Archbishop of San Salvador, Oscar Romero, an outspoken critic of the government's human rights violations, who had called upon President Carter, Christian to Christian, to cease providing military aid, was assassinated. In his last sermon, he had addressed the security forces with these words: "I beseech you, I beg you, I order you, in the name of God, stop the repression." The next day, he became the 11th priest murdered in El Salvador in 3 years. At the funeral of the martyred archbishop, who had been a nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize the year before, 23 members of the U.S. House of Representatives being among his nominators, a bomb was thrown amongst the mourners in the plaza, followed by rifle and automatic fire, all emanating from the National Palace and some of the office buildings flanking the plaza, just as in January. At least 40 people were reported killed and hundreds injured. Junta President Duarte tried to put the blame for the funeral carnage on the left. His case rested apparently on bald statement and nothing else, for all eyewitness reports stated that the bomb and gunfire came from the National Palace and the other government buildings. A statement issued by 8 bishops and 16 other foreign church visitors who had been present denied the government's version. 7 years were to pass before Duarte, elected to the presidency in 1984, accused former Army Major Roberto D'Aubuisson, the prominent leader of the country's right wing, with having ordered Romero's murder. Though this was a belief already widely held, the public accusation created a stir in El Salvador and the United States. The CIA, it turned out, knew the facts no later than 1 year after the assassination. D'Aubuisson, it should be noted, was a man who once told 3 European reporters, "You Germans are very intelligent. You realized that the Jews were responsible for the spread of communism, and you began to kill them." The American-trained former intelligence officer was never arrested because of immunity arising from his being a deputy in the National Assembly. He died in 1992. During the early months of 1980, the government, with direct American influence and input, enacted a program of agrarian reform, the sine qua non of social change in El Salvador. Its key provision, tenant farmers gaining title to the plots they worked, was similar to programs the U.S. had advocated in a number of other third world hotspots since the 1950s, and for the same reasons, as a counterinsurgency tactic, stealing the guerrillas' thunder, and to make the government receiving U.S. military aid appear more deserving in the eyes of Congress and the world. A memorandum from the Agency for International Development, AID, in mid-1980, commenting on reaction in El Salvador to the program of land to the tiller, says in part, "Many believe it is a symbolic and cosmetic measure which was proposed because it would look good to certain American politicians, and not necessarily because it would be beneficial or significant in the Salvadorian context. The reaction of the Salvadorian agrarian elite could have been predicted. They expelled many thousands of peasants from their meager plots to preclude land being turned over to them. This was not the worst. The testimony of a technician of the Instituto Salvadorino de Transformación Agraria, established to oversee the program, the troops came and told the workers the land was theirs now. They could elect their own leaders and run it themselves. The peasants couldn't believe their ears, but they held elections that very night. The next morning the troops came back and I watched as they shot every one of the elected leaders. This was not an isolated case. The Assistant Minister of Agriculture, Jorge Alberto Villacorta, in his resignation letter in March 1980, stated that during the first days of the reform, to cite one case, 5 directors and 2 presidents of new campesino organizations were assassinated, and I am informed that this repressive practice continues to increase. Force, wrote Karl Marx, is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. Revolution was now the only item of importance on the political agenda of the opposition, united as never before, united more by a common enemy than by a common ideology. But many saw this pluralism as strength rather than weakness. Leftists would now be fighting alongside former Christian Democrats whom only shortly before they had accused of serving U.S. imperialism. If Jimmy Carter's trumpeted devotion to human rights was to be taken seriously, his administration clearly had no alternative but to side with the Salvadorian opposition, or at least keep its hands strictly out of the fighting. The Carter administration, however, with only an occasional backward glance at its professed principles, continued its military support of the government. Within days before his term ended in January 1981, Carter ordered a total of $10 million in military aid along with additional American advisors to be sent to El Salvador, an action characterized by one observer as President Carter's foreign policy establishment's last convulsive effort to evade responsibility for having been too soft in dealing with the Salvadorian rebels. 2 years later, Private Citizen Carter stated, "I think the government in El Salvador is one of the bloodthirstiest in the hemisphere now." The Reagan administration, to whom human rights was a suspect term invented by leftists, had little fear of the too soft label. Its approach to the conflict was threefold: a sharp escalation, both quantitatively and qualitatively, in the American military involvement in El Salvador. B. A public relations campaign to put a human face on the military junta. C. A concurrent exercise in news management to convince the American public and the world that the Salvadorian opposition had no legitimate cause for revolution, which was to say that what the Salvadorians had experienced during the previous 2 decades, indeed, for half a century, had little or nothing to do with their uprising. This, it turned out, was the inspiration of unprovoked, mindless, left-wing terrorists abetted by the Soviet Union, by Nicaragua, by Cuba. The Red Devils were at it again. Military escalation. El Salvador did not turn into another Vietnam quicksand for the United States, as many critics of the left and center warned. But for the Salvadorian people, the war and its horror dragged on as interminably as it did for the Vietnamese, and for the same reason, American support of a regime, one even more loathsome than in Vietnam, which would have crumbled dismally if left to its own resources. Despite overwhelmingly superior military might, the government could hold the insurgents to no more than a stalemate. The amount of American military aid to El Salvador from 1980 to the early 1990s, for the hardware alone, ran into the billions of dollars. $6 billion is the figure commonly used in the press, but the true figure will never be known. The Arms Control and Foreign Policy Caucus, a bipartisan congressional group, accused the Reagan administration in the mid-1980s of supplying insufficient, misleading, and in some cases false information concerning aid to El Salvador. The administration, concluded the caucus study, categorized most military aid as development aid and undervalued the real cost of the hardware even when it was properly categorized as military aid. To this must be added the cost of training Salvadorian military personnel by the thousands in the United States and the Panama Canal Zone, as well as in El Salvador. The further training which was provided in the earlier years by Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay at U.S. behest, and the substantial military aid routed through Israel, a maneuver employed by the United States elsewhere in Central America as well. One telling result of this massive provision of weapons and training, as well as the money to pay higher salaries, was the sizable expansion of the Salvadorian armed forces and other security services. From an estimated 7,000 to 12,000 men in 1979, the Army alone jumped to more than 22,000 by 1983, with an additional 11,000 civilian security forces. 3 years later, the total of these two forces had spiraled to 53,000. The equipment available to them flowed endlessly. When, for example, in January 1982, the rebels destroyed 16 to 18 aircraft in a raid upon an airport, the United States replaced them in a matter of weeks with 28 new aircraft. Part of the air power available to the government were U.S. reconnaissance planes fitted with sophisticated surveillance equipment which could provide almost instant intelligence on guerrilla movements before and after combat operations and designate bombing targets. The guerrillas had neither air power nor a practical anti-aircraft capability until November 1990, when they used a Soviet-made surface-to-air missile for the first time. Predictably, the bombing, as well as the strafing and napalming, took the lives of many more civilians than guerrillas who had better learned how to avoid the attacks. Countless dwellings were leveled in the process, villages destroyed, a nation of refugees created. Civilian deaths, whether from air or ground raids, were not necessarily accidental, as the many massacre stories make evident. It is a basic tenet of counterinsurgency. Kill the sympathizers and you win the war. Officially, the U.S. military presence in El Salvador was limited to an advisory capacity. In actuality, military and CIA personnel played a more active role on a continuous basis from as early as 1980. About 20 Americans were killed or wounded in helicopter and plane crashes while flying reconnaissance or other missions over combat areas. Moreover, the American program for training Salvadorian pilots, bombardiers, and gunners could easily serve to conceal the advisors' direct participation in these operations while accompanying their trainees. Considerable evidence surfaced of a U.S. role in the ground fighting as well. There were numerous reports of armed Americans spotted in combat areas, a report by CBS News of U.S. advisors fighting side by side with government troops, and reports of other Americans, some ostensibly mercenaries, killed in action. The extent of American mercenary involvement in El Salvador is not known, but Lawrence Bailey, a former U.S. Marine, has stated that he was part of a team of 40 American soldiers of fortune paid by wealthy Salvadorian families living in Miami to protect their plantations from takeover by the rebels. During the Iran-Contra hearings in 1987, it was disclosed that at least until 1985, CIA paramilitary personnel had been organizing and leading special Salvadorian army units into combat areas to track down guerrillas and call in airstrikes. These bit-by-bit disclosures pointed to a frequent, if not routine, American involvement in the ongoing combat. In September 1988, another news item related that U.S. military advisors were caught in a gun battle between Salvadorian army forces and guerrillas, and that, in self-defense, they opened fire on the rebels. The degree of overall control of the military operation by the United States is perhaps best captured by an excerpt from an interview given to Playboy magazine in 1984 by President Duarte, one of the few Christian Democrat leaders of the earlier days still working within the government. Playboy: do the American military advisors also tell you how to run the war? Duarte: this is the problem, no? The root of this problem is that the aid is given under such conditions that its use is really decided by the Americans and not by us. Decisions like how many planes or helicopters we buy, how we spend our money, how many trucks we need, how many bullets and of what caliber, how many pairs of boots and where our priorities should be. All of that, and all the money is spent over there. We never even see a penny of it, because everything arrives here already paid for. In Duarte's previous incarnation as a government opponent, his view of the Yankees was even harsher. U.S. policy in Latin America, he said in 1969, was designed to maintain the Ibero-American countries in a condition of direct dependence upon the international political decisions most beneficial to the United States, both at the hemisphere and world levels. Thus, the North Americans preach to us of democracy while everywhere they support dictatorships. Duarte's ideology, however, appears to have been a flexible and marketable commodity. At some point in the 1970s, if not earlier, he began to covertly supply the CIA with intelligence. A human face. On January 28, 1982, President Reagan certified to Congress that the El Salvador government was making a concerted and significant effort to comply with internationally recognized human rights, and that it was achieving substantial control over all elements of its own armed forces, so as to bring to an end the indiscriminate torture and murder of Salvadorian citizens by these forces. The language was that imposed by Congress upon the administration if the flow of arms and American military personnel was to continue. 2 days earlier, the American and foreign press had carried the story of how government troops had engaged in a massacre of the people of the village of El Mozote in December. From 700 to 1,000 persons were reported killed, mostly the elderly, women, and children. When a very long, detailed account of this incident appeared eventually, in 1993, it became more apparent than ever that this was one of the most repulsive and cruelest massacres of the 20th century carried out by ground troops face to face with their victims. People hacked to death by machetes, many beheaded, a child thrown in the air and caught on a bayonet, an orgy of rapes of very young girls before they were killed. If we don't kill them, the children now, they'll just grow up to be guerrillas, barked an army officer to a reluctant soldier, anti-communism at its zenith. Both immediately and thereafter, the massacre was attended by denials and a cover-up by the State Department, with abundant media complicity. The State Department's defense of its position before a congressional committee left the committee members conspicuously underwhelmed, even though the congressman did not yet know the full story. 2 days after the president's certification, the world could read how Salvadorian soldiers had pulled about 20 people out of their beds in the middle of the night, tortured them, and then killed them, meanwhile finding the time to rape several teenage girls. Earlier the same month, the New York Times had published an interview with a deserter from the Salvadorian army who described a class where severe methods of torture were demonstrated on teenage prisoners. He stated that 8 U.S. military advisors, apparently Green Berets, were present. Watching will make you feel more like a man, a Salvadorian officer apprised the recruits, adding that they should not feel pity of anyone, but only hate for those who are enemies of our country. Another Salvadorian, a former member of the National Guard, later testified, "I belonged to a squad of 12. We devoted ourselves to torture and to finding people whom we were told were guerrillas. I was trained in Panama for 9 months by the unintelligible of the United States for anti-guerrilla warfare. Part of the time we were instructed about torture. Officers of the National Guard were also trained in the United States." In August 1986, CBS television reported that 3 senior Guard officers who had been linked to right-wing death squads received training at a police academy in Phoenix. In 1984, Amnesty International reported that it had received regular, often daily, reports identifying El Salvador's regular security and military units as responsible for the torture, disappearance, and killing of non-combatant civilians from all sectors of Salvadorian society. A number of patients have allegedly been removed from their beds or operating theaters and tortured and murdered. Types of torture reported by those who have survived arrest and interrogation included beatings, sexual abuse, use of chemicals to disorient, mock executions, and the burning of flesh with sulfuric acid. In light of the above and many other reports of a similar nature, it can be appreciated that the Reagan administration had to exercise some creativity in getting around congressional hesitation about continued military aid to the government of El Salvador. Thus it was that in March 1984, the administration tacked on a request for additional military aid to legislation to send U.S. food supplies to starving Africans. A few days later, it tacked on a request for support of the Nicaraguan Contras to a bill to provide emergency fuel, spending for the poor in parts of the United States, which were suffering a severe winter. Death squad executions, military massacres, the Legion of the Disappeared, the numbers reached well into the tens of thousands, and the death squads may have reached their arm into the United States. A number of Americans and Salvadorians living in Los Angeles and working with refugees or actively opposing U.S. military aid to El Salvador received death threats in 1987. Rev. Luis Olivares, a Catholic priest whose church is part of the sanctuary movement, was sent an anonymous letter bearing the letters EM, which were often found on the doors or buildings of people who were targeted in El Salvador. The letters stand for Escuadrón Muerto, Death Squad. In July 1987, a Salvadorian woman named Yanira Correa, who had received threatening phone calls and letters, was kidnapped outside the Los Angeles office of the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPs. Two men, speaking with what she described as Salvadorian accents, forced her at knife point into a van, interrogated her about her political activities and colleagues, cut her hands with a knife, burnt her fingers with cigarettes, sexually assaulted her with a stick, then raped her. A month earlier, she had narrowly escaped being abducted, along with her 3-year-old son. Other activists had their cars smashed or vandalized. For several years under the Reagan administration, the FBI conducted a nationwide investigation of CISPs. During this period, some of the organization's offices were broken into with nothing of value taken except files. It is imperative at this time to formulate some plan of attack against CISPs, reads one FBI teletype later made public. On some days during the 1980s, Washington officials issued warnings to the Salvadorian government to improve its human rights record, or told Congress that the record was improving, or told the world how much worse that record would be if not for American influence. On most other days, the United States continued to build up each and every component of the military and paramilitary forces engaged in the atrocities. In 1984, in an interview with the New York Times, Colonel Roberto Eulalio Santibanez, a former Salvadorian military official who had served at the highest level of the security police, confirmed, for those who may still have entertained doubts, that the network of death squads had been shaped by leading Salvadorian officials and was still directed by them. He also revealed that one of these officials, Colonel Nicholas Carranza, the head of the Treasury Police, which have long been considered the least disciplined and most brutal of the Salvadorian security forces, had been receiving more than $90,000 a year during the previous 5 or 6 years from the CIA. Although some members of the Treasury Police were linked by the Reagan administration itself to death squad activities, the United States continued to train and equip them. In a visit to San Salvador in February 1989, Vice President Dan Quayle told Army leaders that death squad killings and other human rights violations attributed to the military had to be ended. 10 days later, the U.S. trained at Lacatal Battalion, which was believed to have a U.S. trainer assigned to it at all times, attacked a guerrilla field hospital, killing at least 10 people, including 5 patients, a doctor, and a nurse, and raping at least 2 of the female victims before shooting them. Sources close to the El Salvador military said afterward that Quayle's warning was not taken seriously, but as rhetoric aimed at the U.S. Congress and the American public. In October 1989, former Salvadorian Army Commando Cesar Vileman Joya Martinez, in an interview on the CBS Evening News, related that he and others in his unit, the intelligence section of the Army's 1st Brigade, had acted as a clandestine death squad, that the 2 U.S. military advisors attached to the unit were aware of the assassinations, although they refused to hear the details, and that the advisors supplied money to his unit that helped maintain 2 civilian vehicles used for death squad operations and a safe house that served as a secret base of operations and storage of weapons. In subsequent interviews with the American press, Joya Martinez stated that the advisors had used the names Mauricio Torres and Raul Antonio Lazo, that his unit had carried out 74 assassinations of Salvadorian dissidents between April and July of 1989, and that he himself had been personally involved in 8 torture murders. Apropos of deadly bombings in El Salvador in November of dissident organizations, a union hall and an organization of mothers of the disappeared, he added that his unit had received explosives training from U.S. advisors. The Salvadorian embassy in Washington, while denying any government involvement in death squad activities, did confirm that Joya Martinez was a member of the intelligence unit of the 1st Brigade. In July 1990, an aide to Rep. Joseph Moakley, Democrat, Massachusetts, chairman of the Speaker's Task Force on El Salvador, declared, "The fact that Joya Martinez has been in the U.S. since last August, given all kinds of interviews, been arrested, and no one from the government has bothered to question him, seems pretty strange, unless people don't want to find the answers." On the 12th of that month, Joya Martinez had been arrested for having illegally entered the United States after being deported 6 years earlier. After a lengthy legal battle, he was ordered deported back to El Salvador in October 1992. His supporters in the United States expressed their concern about his safety in El Salvador, to which a State Department official responded, presumably with a straight face, that Joya Martinez has admitted to killings and torture, and it would be callous to the victims to prevent him from standing trial. A few weeks after Joya Martinez went public in the United States, one of the most shocking atrocities in this war of shocking atrocities occurred. 6 Jesuit priests at the University of Central America in San Salvador were shot to death in cold blood at their campus residence, along with their housekeeper and her young daughter. A witness, whom the killers failed to observe, Lucia Barrera de Serna, said she saw 5 armed men in uniform carry out the murders. The Salvadorian military, whom the Roman Catholic order had often criticized for human rights violations, were the immediate and logical suspects. Because of an extraordinary outcry against the crime in the United States and internationally, including the creation of the Special Congressional Task Force referred to above, 2 months later 9 officers and enlisted men were arrested. A platoon from the Atlacatal Battalion, 7 of whom, it turned out, had only 2 days before the murders participated in combat training exercises supervised by the U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets, in El Salvador. Almost 2 years passed before any of those arrested were convicted of the crime. 2 relatively low-level officers, their higher-ups who gave the order, were not touched. Yet, this was an achievement in a country where thousands of people had been killed by military death squads, and no officer had ever before been tried, let alone convicted, for murder or other human rights abuse. The Salvadorian military tolerated the trial of the officers because Congress had made prosecution of the killers a condition for continuing military aid. During the 2-year period, as well as after the convictions, officials of the Bush administration appeared to be trying to thwart the investigation and aid in a cover-up by such tactics as the following: grossly intimidating Serna and labeling her a liar. B. Refusing on grounds of national security to provide a Salvadorian court with classified documents that dealt with the case. Withholding, on the same grounds, substantive material from journalists making Freedom of Information Act requests. C. Refusing for a long time to allow questioning by the investigating judge of U.S. Army Major Eric Buckland, stationed in El Salvador, who had learned of the Salvadorian military's culpability shortly after the murders from Salvadorian Colonel Carlos Aviles, then imposing a series of conditions on Buckland's questioning that served to conceal much of his story. D. Putting Buckland through such horrendous interrogation that he underwent an apparent nervous breakdown. E. Immediately informing the Salvadorian High Command about what Aviles had revealed to Buckland, which caused Aviles much grief. Father Charles Byrne, vice-rector of the Jesuit University, declared in 1991 that the Americans were helping to protect the Salvadorian Army High Command all along. They were afraid the whole house of cards would fall if the investigation went any further. A year later, United Nations investigators were still complaining that the United States was slow in turning over vital information about the case. The cruelty level of the guerrillas' military and political campaign generally stood in sharp contrast to that of the government. Newsweek reported in 1983 that when the rebels capture a town, they treat the civilians well, paying for food and holding destruction to a minimum. And they have begun to free most of the government troops they capture, which helps to persuade other soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. Eventually, however, the guerrillas began to treat civilians more harshly, in particular those suspected of informing or of other collaboration with the government, or those refusing to collaborate with rebel forces. Some peasants reportedly were forced to leave their villages and farms as punishment. Several village mayors were killed. Young men were forcibly recruited to join the rebels. However, given the numerous instances of disinformation disseminated by the Salvadorian government about the rebels, reports of guerrilla ruthlessness must be approached with caution. The following case is instructive. See the notes for reference to other examples. In February 1988, the New York Times reported that villagers say guerrillas publicly executed 2 peasants because they had applied for and received new voter registration cards. According to the villagers, the guerrillas placed the voting cards of the 2 men in their mouths after executing them as a warning to others not to take part in the elections. The story was included in a State Department booklet to highlight the guerrillas' campaign of intimidation and terrorism. The booklet was mailed to Congress, newspaper editors, and other opinion makers. But the story, it turned out, was the invention of a Salvadorian army propaganda specialist who had placed it in the San Salvador newspaper El Mundo. From there, it was picked up by the New York Times reporter who gave the impression that he had interviewed villagers with first-hand knowledge of the incident, instead of attributing the story to the military as had El Mundo. The Times later recanted the story. Outside agitators. "Sometimes I feel like Sisyphus," said a senior Reagan administration official involved in developing U.S. Latin America policy in March 1982. "Every time we head up the hill to explain or justify our policy, the stone comes crashing down on top of us." 2 weeks earlier, Secretary of State Alexander Haig had asserted that the United States had overwhelming and irrefutable evidence that the insurgents were controlled from outside by non-Salvadorians. Haig, however, declined to provide any details of the evidence, saying it would jeopardize intelligence sources. Challenged to prove his charges 2 days later, the good general insisted that the United States had unchallengeable evidence of Nicaraguan and Cuban involvement in the command and control of the operation in El Salvador, and, oddly enough, only the day before a Nicaraguan military man had been captured there. As it turned out, according to the Mexican embassy in San Salvador, the man was a student on his way back to school in Mexico from Nicaragua, traveling overland because he couldn't afford to fly. The following week, a Nicaraguan was captured fighting with the guerrillas. He told U.S. Embassy and Salvadorian army officials that he had been trained in Cuba and Ethiopia, then sent to El Salvador by the Nicaraguan government. The State Department was understandably excited. It presented the young man at a press conference in Washington, at which time he declared that he had never been to Cuba or Ethiopia, had joined the guerrillas on his own, and had made his previous statements under torture by his Salvadorian captors. He added that he had never seen another Nicaraguan or Cuban in El Salvador, and denied that Nicaragua had provided aid to the guerrillas. Then there were 2 Nicaraguan Air Force defectors, reported Time magazine during the same period, who were scheduled to bear witness to their country's involvement in El Salvador, but by week's end were judged not ready to face the press. Time entitled its story, "A Lot of Show, but No Tell. The U.S. Bungles Its Evidence of Foreign Subversion in El Salvador." In January 1981, U.S. diplomats disclosed that 5 boats had landed in El Salvador containing 100 well-armed, well-trained guerrillas, allegedly from Nicaragua. They knew the boats had come from Nicaragua because they were made from wood of trees not native to El Salvador. No sign, dead or alive, of any of the 100 invaders was ever found, however. 100 seemed to be the number of choice for the Reagan administration. "That was the count of Cuban combat troops," said a senior State Department policymaker, who were sent to El Salvador in the fall of 1981 by way of Nicaragua. "They were brought in clandestinely and given operational responsibilities in El Salvador," he asserted. The later whereabouts and actions of the Cubans likewise remained a mystery. The world was also informed that Soviet and Chinese weapons had been seized from rebels, and this was cited as further proof of outside communist aid. The weapons capture may have been real, although the CIA has long had warehouses full of communist weapons of all kinds, suitable for all occasions. But then what were we to make of the US, Israeli, Belgian, and German weapons which, by Washington's admission a month later, were also to be found amongst the rebels? The world arms traffic is indeed wide open and fluid. In neighboring Honduras, the US-supported Contras were using Soviet-made missiles to shoot down Soviet-made helicopters of Nicaragua. Moreover, the Salvadorian rebels captured weapons from government forces, and they claimed that they also purchased arms from corrupt Salvadorian army officers, a practice common to other Latin American guerrilla wars. A source cited by the New York Times corroborated the rebels' claim. The centerpiece of the Reagan administration's campaign to prove the international conspiracy nature of the revolution in El Salvador was its white paper issued a month after taking office and based largely on purported captured guerrilla documents, some of which were included in the report. Amongst the various analyses of the white paper which cast grave doubts upon its claims was the one in the Wall Street Journal by Jonathan Whitney. This included an interview with a State Department official, John D. Glassman, who was given the major credit for the white paper. Admitted Mr. Glassman, parts of the paper were possibly misleading and over-embellished. It contained mistakes and guessing. Said the Wall Street Journal, a close examination indicates that, if anything, Mr. Glassman may be understating the case in his concession that the white paper contains mistakes and guessing. Amongst the many specific shortcomings of the paper pointed out in the article was that statistics of armament shipments into El Salvador, supposedly drawn directly from the documents, were extrapolated, Mr. Glassman concedes, and in questionable ways it seems. Much information in the white paper can't be found in the documents at all. It was not merely the accuracy of the white paper that was questioned, but the authenticity of the documents themselves. Apropos of this, former U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador, Robert White, sacked by Reagan because of excessive commitment to human rights and reforms, commented, "The only thing that even makes me think that these documents were genuine was that they proved so little." When pressed to state what proof his government had of Nicaraguan intervention, President Duarte declined to answer on the grounds that the world would not believe him anyway. But President Reagan had some evidence to offer. He saw the hand of foreign masters pulling strings in the fact that demonstrators in Canada carried the same signs as demonstrators in the United States. U.S. out of El Salvador. But all of this was essentially besides the point. Revolutions are not exported like so many cartons of soap. We have seen what the circumstances were in El Salvador for decades, which finally provoked people to take up the gun. Ambassador White, no champion of the rebels' cause, observed that the revolution situation came about in El Salvador because you had what was one of the most selfish oligarchies the world has ever seen, combined with a corrupt security force. Whether Cuba existed or not, you would still have a revolutionary situation in El Salvador. Education Minister turned guerrilla, Salvador Semeoa, speaking in 1981, asserted that U.S. charges that the Soviet bloc was directing the guerrilla movement reveals Washington's deep ignorance of our movement. He pointed out that 3 of the 5 guerrilla groups that made up the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, FMLN, were strongly anti-Soviet. Semeoa added, "To say we are run by Cuba because we have a relationship with Cuba is like saying we're a Christian movement because we have received enormous help from the church. Instead of seeing us as communist subversives, the U.S. should see us as a people struggling to survive." Despite American patrol boats in the Gulf of Fonseca, which separates El Salvador from Nicaragua, AWACS surveillance planes in the skies over the Caribbean, and an abundance of aerial photographs, despite a large U.S. radar installation in Honduras manned by 50 American military technicians, the finest electronic monitoring equipment modern technology had to offer, and all the informers that CIA money could buy. Despite it all, the Reagan administration singularly failed to support its case that the fires of the Salvadorian Revolution were stoked by Nicaraguan and Cuban coals, nor by the Soviet Union, Vietnam, the PLO, Ethiopia, or any of the other countries indicted at one time or another as important suppliers of military aid. In any case, whatever military support the Salvadorian insurgents actually received from abroad, necessarily limited to what could be carried by the occasional clandestine small truck or boat, plainly did not belong in the same league, nor on the same planet, as the huge transport planefuls and shipfuls of American aid, in all its forms, to the Salvadorian government. The United States had waged ruthless war against the Salvadorian Revolution and threatened worse. In April 1991, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, announced that, if necessary, the civil war in El Salvador can be resolved the way it was in the Persian Gulf. In early 1992, the war came to an official end when a United Nations Commission, after a year-and-a-half effort, finally got the warring sides to agree to a ceasefire and a peace agreement. A major offensive launched by the guerrillas in late 1989, in which they brought the war home to wealthy neighborhoods and Americans in the capital, had made clear to Washington and its Salvadorian allies, once again, finally, that the war was unwinnable. In February 1990, Gen. Maxwell Thurman, the head of the U.S. Southern Command, told Congress that the El Salvador government was not able to defeat the rebels, and that the only way to end the fighting was through negotiation. Moreover, the ostensible end of the Cold War had undermined the United States' professed rationale for, and may have relaxed its obsession with defeating communism in El Salvador. At the same time, Congress was balking more and more about continuing military aid to the Salvadorian government, an attitude that had been growing ever since the November 1989 murder of the Jesuit priests. One of the many provisions of the complex peace agreement was the establishment of a UN Commission of the Truth to investigate the worst acts of violence since 1980. In March of 1993, the Commission presented its report. Among its findings and conclusions were the following. The military forces, supported by the government and the civilian establishment, were plainly the main perpetrators of massacres, executions, torture, and kidnappings during the Civil War. These acts could not be blamed on the excesses of war, but on premeditated and ideologically inspired decisions to kill. The Commission called for the dismissal of more than 40 high-ranking military personnel, including Defense Minister Gen. Rene Emilio Ponce, a longtime favorite of U.S. officials, whom it found had given the orders that led to the murders of the priests, and stipulated that none should ever be allowed to return to military or security duty, and should be banned from other public and political life for 10 years. Dismissal and a 10-year ban was also specified for government officials and bureaucrats who abused human rights or took part in a cover-up of the abuses, including the President of the Supreme Court. Right-wing parties in the Salvadorian National Assembly quickly pushed through an amnesty law barring prosecution for any crimes committed during the war. Several leaders of the left were singled out for the assassinations of 11 mayors during the war. A special investigation of death squads was called for. These squads, said the report, were often operated by the military and supported by powerful businessmen, landowners, and some leading politicians. The peace accords did not put an end to this. Dozens of leaders and members of the FMLN were assassinated during 1992 and 1993, as well as a few from the right. Cited as the most notorious of the death squad leaders by the report was Roberto D'Aubuisson, the principal founder of the Nationalist Republican Alliance, ARENA Party, the party of the country's current president, Alfredo Cristiani. D'Aubuisson, the report confirmed, hired the sharpshooter who killed Archbishop Romero. Other sins laid at the doorstep of the government were the rapes and killings of 3 American nuns and a female religious worker in 1980, the murder of 2 American labor advisors in 1981, and the assassination in 1982 of 4 Dutch journalists, whose reports were evidently considered favorable to the guerrillas. The Commission did not focus on any American role in the abuses and cover-up. The role of the United States in El Salvador is a role more effectively studied by the U.S. Congress, said Commission member Thomas Bergenthal, an American jurist, at a news conference. However, the Commission did chastise the United States for failing to rein in Salvadorian exiles in Miami who helped administer death squad activities between 1980 and 1983, with apparently little attention from the U.S. government. Such use of American territory for acts of terrorism abroad should be investigated and never allowed to be repeated. Cuban exiles, of course, have been using Miami as a base for terrorism abroad, as well as in the U.S., for 30 years. Members of Congress, outraged by the findings of the Commission of the Truth, called for the declassification of State Department, Defense Department, and CIA files on El Salvador to help determine whether the Reagan and Bush administrations had concealed evidence from Congress about widespread human rights abuses by their Salvadorian allies. The Commission's report, simply verifies what a number of us knew all through the 80s, said Rep. David Obey, that our own government was lying like hell to us. The report proves that the Reagan administration was willing to lie and certify to anything to get the money it wanted. Various of the more than 12,000 once-secret documents released by the Clinton administration unequivocally confirmed Obey's charge. Other papers revealed that the current vice president, Francisco Moreno, had organized death squads. The CIA referred to Roberto D'Aubuisson as egocentric, reckless, and perhaps mentally unstable. He trafficked in drugs and smuggled arms. His paramilitary unit was responsible for thousands of murders. And in 1983, he and his advisors were invited by American Ambassador Dean Hinton to have lunch with the visiting U.S. representative to the United Nations, Jeane Kirkpatrick. 6 years later, shortly before the CIA reported that D'Aubuisson's inner circle had plotted to assassinate President Cristiani, Ambassador William G. Walker invited him to the embassy's 4th of July party. American military advisors trained a militia of some 50 wealthy Salvadorians, ostensibly for them to be able to defend their own lavish homes against a rebel attack. But the group was actually linked to D'Aubuisson, and their militia was a cover for the recruitment, training, and possible dispatch of paramilitary civilian death squads. Ambassador Walker halted the training as soon as he learned of it, despite protests from the chief of the U.S. military advisory mission. Another memo, written by a Defense Department official, argued that the wealthy Salvadorians might fund death squads, but would not get blood on their own hands. On March 20th, 1994, the ruling party Arena and its main allies scored a victory in elections held to choose a new president, National Assembly, and hundreds of municipal governments. With the exception of a few reforms touching upon civil liberties, whose significance remains to be seen, the outcome left the society at essentially the same place it was in 1980 when the war had just begun and José Napoleon Duarte had said, "For 50 years the same people had all the power, all the money, all the jobs, all the education." One could now say, for more than 60 years, why had more than half the people of El Salvador, most of them very poor, voted for parties intimately connected with not only the wealthy, but with death squads? The new president, Armando Calderón Sol, had long and close ties to death squad godfather Roberto D'Aubuisson, a large portrait of whom hung in his office. The declassified documents referred to above raised questions about Calderón Sol himself, connections to a kidnapping and to a group of young Arena militants who bombed the Ministry of Agriculture and wreaked other havoc in the early 1980s in an attempt to destabilize the government whose new agrarian reform was supposed to take land from the wealthy. Arena's sophisticated multi-million-dollar campaign relied heavily on nurturing two kinds of fears: the traditional fear of communism, inculcated by decades of authoritarian rule, and the supposed economic incompetence of the left, as typified by the Sandinista rule in Nicaragua. Further, ignoring their own violent history, Arena portrayed the left as terrorists who were exclusively responsible for the war's death and destruction. How honest and fair had the actual voting been? Was the right willing to end a half-century of political exclusion of the left? Besides having a great deal more money at its disposal than its opponents, the Arena party in power had controlled the press in El Salvador for many years. The one daily paper, Diario Latino, which had dared to show a brief independence, was destroyed by bombs. Moreover, the makeup of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, TSE, which supervised the election, was based on the election of 1991, which the FMLN had boycotted. It was thus dominated by Arena, with no one from the FMLN. Many points of contention were raised about the voting, such as the following. A large number of people who registered to vote were unable to do so because they didn't receive their voting card. According to United Nations monitors, as of February 1st, these cases came to more than 500,000, equal to 20% of the electorate. After the election, the FMLN estimated the number of such non-voters at 340,000. 74,000 other applicants were rejected because they couldn't produce a birth certificate. Often this was because the local office of records had been destroyed in the war. Another large block of people held valid voting cards but couldn't vote because they had no transportation to a distant polling station. This was exacerbated, reportedly, by a slowdown in bus service by bus companies owned by arena supporters and the arena-controlled bus drivers union. Many made it to the polling stations with their voting cards only to be kept from voting because their names did not appear on the voter registration lists or were spelled incorrectly, at least 25,000 such cases according to the UN. Several times that, said the FMLN. Other potential voters left the stations without casting their ballots because very long lines and an extremely cumbersome and snail-paced processing system left them still waiting when the polls closed. These problems, of course, affected the poor, the rural, the less educated, and the first-time voters the most, the base of the FMLN's support. The TSE refused international advice, declined to spend money to transport voters to the polls, and made voting unnecessarily complicated, UN observers said. There was frightening mismanagement of the election beyond our worst expectations, said a senior UN official. There was widespread lack of trust by the electorate before the voting, and now it's much worse. The TSE is completely discredited and has therefore tarnished the election. The FMLN claimed the irregularities cheated the party out of several municipal and legislative seats. A contention lent credence by the UN observers who stated that thousands of people were denied voting cards in 30 towns where the FMLN was strong. The party challenged the results in 37 cities and towns, but the TSE rejected all the claims, a decision that Rafael Lopez Pintor, who headed the UN Electoral Division, called shocking. A team of observers representing the US government also said it was troubled that many of the procedures cited as administrative defects in previous elections continued to be practiced. In the days immediately following the vote, election authorities delayed the release of official results. Then, on the third day, they abruptly cut off access to party monitors to computerized tabulations. The FMLN said that initial tabulations showed that many ballot boxes contained more votes than the legal maximum of 400, some of them 2 to 3 times as many. They also claimed that in San Miguel, one of the country's largest cities, a group of arena militants had absconded with 15 ballot boxes. As it turned out, in the announced result for the presidency, Arena got 641,000 votes, 49% of the total, while the Democratic Coalition, which included the FMLN, was credited with 326,000 votes, or 25%. Failure of any party to win a majority necessitated a runoff election a month later, at which time Arena won 68% of the vote to the coalition's 32%. Because the winner of the runoff was a completely foregone conclusion, there were undoubtedly many poor people who didn't vote because they were unwilling to go through the great inconvenience and uncertainty a second time. There was also the matter of intimidation. According to observers from the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPs. Meanwhile, army helicopters buzzed cities where the opposition was strong. Soldiers set up checkpoints and machine gun nests in towns traumatized by army massacres during the war. The government did its best to instill fear in the electorate, and must have scared many voters into staying home. Before the election, some workers were warned that if the FMLN won, heads would roll or they would be fired. Inasmuch as a polling official tore off the corner of each ballot, containing the same number as on the ballot, a voter could see that someone could save his number and check how he voted later. The Los Angeles Times reported the story of the master of ceremonies at a rally staged by Arena, attended by a number of peasants, farmers, and market vendors. All those who support Arena, raise your hats, the MC implored the crowd. A few people lifted their hats. All those who support Arena, raise your hats, he tried again. And those who don't raise their hats are Tarengos, he added, invoking a slang word for terrorists, used by the army throughout this country's brutal civil war. A lot of people took their hats off. For the benefit of which Salvadorians did Arena remain in power? For which of them had 75,000 civilians been killed? For whom was the U.S. Treasury reduced by $6 billion? 2 reports from the New York Times, over canapes served by hovering waiters at a party. A guest said she was convinced that God had created 2 distinct classes of people, the rich and people to serve them. She described herself as charitable for allowing the poor to work as her servants. It's the best you can do, she said. The woman's outspokenness was unusual, but her attitude is shared by a large segment of the Salvadoran upper class. The separation between classes is so rigid that even small expressions of kindness across the divide are viewed with suspicion. When an American, visiting an ice cream store, remarked that he was shopping for a birthday party for his maid's child. Other store patrons immediately stopped talking and began staring at the American. Finally, an astonished woman in the checkout line spoke out. "You must be kidding," she said. One of their class, who had had enough and was leaving, commented to the Times, "I can't accept the fact that if you're born a peasant here, you die a peasant and your children are going to be peasants. There's no vision that kids of farmhands should be going to Harvard and running this country one day. There's no vision of a modern society." After taking part in Washington's decade-long effort to train and reform the Salvadoran army, many American military advisors have left here angry over the Salvadorans' resistance to change. They say they feel manipulated and betrayed by the Salvadoran officers. The advisors described Salvadoran officers as being mainly interested in amassing wealth and power, as willing to deprive troops of equipment to further the officers' own ends, and as allowing the regular killing or mistreatment of prisoners. None went so far as to say the effort to help the Salvadoran armed forces in their war against a leftist insurgency had been futile. They thought human rights abuses would have been worse, or that the guerrillas might have won the war without their presence. The Times apparently did not ask the advisors whether they believed that the United States government had in some way been forced to take sides in the Civil War. And if not, what had their government's ultimate motive been? And if so, why had they not taken the side of the insurgents? And how bad would the human rights abuses have been if the armed forces had not been provided by Washington with a never-ending supply of every weapon and implement and training known to man to bring destruction, pain and suffering to the greatest number of people?
55. Haiti 1986 1994.
Who will rid me of this turbulent priest? When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist.
Dom Welder Câmara.
What does the government of the United States do when faced with a choice between supporting a group of totalitarian military thugs guilty of murdering thousands, systematic torture, widespread rape, and leaving severely mutilated corpses in the streets, or B, a non-violent priest legally elected to the presidency by a landslide, whom the thugs have overthrown in a coup? But what if the priest is a leftist? During the Duvalier family dictatorship, Francois Papa Doc, 1957 to 71, followed by Jean-Claude Baby Doc, 1971 to 86, both anointed president for life by Papa, the United States trained and armed Haiti's counterinsurgency forces, although most American military aid to the country was covertly channeled through Israel, thus sparing Washington embarrassing questions about supporting brutal governments. After Jean-Claude was forced into exile in February 1986, fleeing to France aboard a U.S. Air Force jet, Washington resumed open assistance. And while Haiti's wretched rabble were celebrating the end of 3 decades of Duvalierism, the United States was occupied in preserving it under new names. Within 3 weeks of Jean-Claude's departure, the U.S. announced that it was providing Haiti with $26.6 million in economic and military aid. And in April, it was reported that another $4 million is being sought to provide the Haitian army with trucks, training, and communications gear to allow it to move around the country and maintain order. The CIA was meanwhile arranging for the release from prison and safe exile abroad of 2 of its Duvalier contacts, both notorious police chiefs, thus saving them from possible death sentences for murder and torture, and acting contrary to the public's passionate wish for retribution against its former tormentors. In September, Haiti's main trade union leader, Yves Richard, declared that Washington was working to undermine the left before the coming elections. U.S. aid organizations, he said, were encouraging people in the countryside to identify and reject the entire left as communist, though the country clearly had a fundamental need for reformers and sweeping changes. Haiti was, and is, the Western Hemisphere's best-known economic, medical, political, judicial, educational, and ecological basket case. At this time, Jean-Bertrand Aristide was a charismatic priest with a broad following in the poorest slums of Haiti, the only church figure to speak out against repression during the Duvalier years. He now denounced the military-dominated elections and called upon Haitians to reject the entire process. His activities figured prominently enough in the electoral campaign to evoke a strong antipathy from U.S. officials. Ronald Reagan, Aristide later wrote, considered him to be a communist. And Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Elliott Abrams, saw fit to attack Aristide while praising the Haitian government in a letter to Time magazine during the election campaign. The Catholic priest first came to prominence in Haiti as a proponent of liberation theology, which seeks to blend the teachings of Christ with inspiring the poor to organize and resist their oppression. When asked why the CIA might have sought to oppose Aristide, a senior official with the Senate Intelligence Committee stated that liberation theology proponents are not too popular at the agency. Maybe second only to the Vatican for not liking liberation theology are the people at Langley, CIA headquarters. Aristide urged a boycott of the elections, saying, "The army is our first enemy." The CIA, on the other hand, funded some of the candidates. The agency later insisted that the purpose of the funding program had not been to oppose Aristide, but to provide a free and open election, by which was meant helping some candidates who didn't have enough money and diminishing Aristide's attempt to have a low turnout, which would have reduced the election's validity. It is not known which candidates the CIA funded or why the agency or the State Department, which reportedly chose the candidates to support, were concerned about such goals in Haiti, when underfunded candidates and low turnouts exist permanently in the United States. The CIA was involved in a range of support for a range of candidates, said an intelligence official directly active in the operation. Countering Aristide's impressive political strength appears to be the only logical explanation for the CIA's involvement, which was authorized by President Reagan and the National Security Council. When the Senate Intelligence Committee demanded to know exactly what the CIA was doing in Haiti and which candidates it was supporting, the agency balked. Eventually, the committee ordered the covert electoral action to cease. A high-ranking source working for the committee said the reason the program was killed was that there are some of us who believe in the neutrality of elections. Nevertheless, it cannot be stated with any certainty that the program was actually halted. The elections scheduled for November 29, 1987 were postponed because of violence. In the rescheduled elections held in January, the candidate favored by the military government was declared the winner in balloting widely perceived as rigged, and in the course of which the CIA was involved in an aborted attempt of unknown nature to influence the elections. There followed more than 2 years of regular political violence, coup attempts, and repression, casting off the vestiges of the Duvalier dictatorship and establishing a new one, until in March 1990 the current military dictator General Prosper Avril was forced by widespread protests to abdicate and was replaced by a civilian government of sorts, but with the military still calling important shots. The United States is not happy with chaos in its client states. It's bad for control, it's bad for business, it's unpredictable who will come out on top, perhaps another Fidel Castro. It was the danger of massive internal uprisings that induced the United States to inform Jean-Claude Duvalier that it was time for him to venture a life of struggle on the French Riviera, and a similar chaotic situation that led the U.S. ambassador to suggest to Avril that it was an apt moment to retire. Transportation into exile for the good general was once again courtesy of Uncle Sam. Thus it was that the American embassy in Port-au-Prince pressured the Haitian officer corps to allow a new election. Neither the embassy nor Aristide himself at this time had reason to expect that he would be a candidate in the election scheduled for December, although he had already been expelled from his religious order, with the blessings of the Vatican, because, amongst other things, of incitement to hatred and violence, and a glorifying of class struggle. Aristide's many followers and friends had often tried in vain to persuade him to run for office. Now they finally succeeded, and in October he became the candidate of a loose coalition of reformist parties and organizations. On the eve of the election, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Andrew Young, visited Aristide and asked him to sign a letter accepting Marc Bazin, the U.S.-backed and funded candidate, as president should Bazin win. Young reportedly said there was fear that if Aristide lost, his followers would take to the streets and reject the results. Young was said to be acting on behalf of his mentor, former President Jimmy Carter, but presumably the White House also had their finger in the pie, evidencing their concern about Aristide's charisma and potential as a leader outside their control. Despite a campaign marred by terror and intimidation, nearly 1,000 UN and Organization of American States, OAS, observers, and an unusually scrupulous Haitian general ensured that a relatively honest balloting took place, in which Aristide was victorious with 67.5% of the vote. People chose him over 10 comparatively bourgeois candidates, wrote an American Haiti scholar who was an international election observer, because of his outspoken and uncompromising opposition to the old ways. Aristide's support actually included a progressive bourgeois element as well as his larger popular base. The president priest took office in February 1991 after a coup attempt against him in January failed. By June, one could read in the Washington Post, proclaiming a political revolution, Aristide, 37, has injected a spirit of hope and honesty into the affairs of government. A radical departure after decades of official venality under the Duvalier family dictatorship and a series of military strongmen. Declaring that his $10,000 monthly salary is not just a scandal, but a crime, Aristide announced on television that he would donate his paychecks to charity. The Catholic priest had long been an incisive critic of U.S. foreign policy because of Washington's support of the Duvalier dynasty and the Haitian military, and he was suspicious of foreign aid, commenting that it all wound up in the pockets of the wealthy. Since 1980, this amounted to $200 million a year, and these were the same 10 years during which the per capita wealth of the country was reduced by 40%. Aristide did not spell out a specific economic program, but was clear about the necessity of a redistribution of wealth, and spoke more of economic justice than of the virtues of the market system. He later wrote, "I have often been criticized for lacking a program, or at least for imprecision in that regard. Was it for lack of time? A poor excuse. In fact, the people had their own program.
Dignity, transparence, simplicity, participation.
These three ideas could be equally well applied in the political and economic sphere and in the moral realm. The bourgeoisie should have been able to understand that its own interest demanded some concessions. We had recreated 1789. Did they want, by their passive resistance, to push the hungry to demand more radical measures? Seriously hampered by the absence in Haiti of a strong traditional left, and confronted by a gridlocked parliament that constitutionally had more power than the president, Aristide didn't succeed in getting any legislation enacted. He did, however, initiate programs in literacy, public health, and agrarian reform, and pressed for an increase in the daily wage, which was often less than $3, a freeze on prices of basic necessities, and a public works program to create jobs. He also increased the feeling of security amongst the population by arresting a number of key paramilitary thugs, and setting in motion a process to eliminate the institution of rural section chiefs, sheriffs, the military's primary instrument of unfettered authority over the lives of the peasants. In office, though not the uncompromising revolutionary firebrand many anticipated, Aristide frequently angered his opponents in the wealthy business class, the parliament, and the army by criticizing their corruptness. The military was particularly vexed by his policies against smuggling and drug trafficking, as well as his attempt to depoliticize them. As for the wealthy civilians, or as they are fondly known, the morally repugnant elite, they did not much care for Aristide's agenda whereby they would pay taxes and share their bounty by creating jobs and reinvesting profits locally rather than abroad. They were, as they remain, positively apoplectic about this little saintly talking priest and his love for the poor. However, Aristide's administration was not, in practice, actually anti-business, and he made it a point to warm up to American officials, foreign capitalists, and some elements of the Haitian military. He also discharged some 2,000 government workers, which pleased the International Monetary Fund and other foreign donors, but Aristide himself regarded these positions as largely useless and corrupt bureaucratic padding. Jean-Bertrand Aristide served less than 8 months as Haiti's president before being deposed, on September 29, 1991, by a military coup in which many hundreds of his supporters were massacred, and thousands more fled to the Dominican Republic or by sea. The slightly built Haitian president, who, in the previous few years, had survived several serious assassination attempts and the burning down of his church while he was inside preaching, was saved now largely through the intervention of the French ambassador. Only the Vatican recognized the new military government, although the coup, of course, was backed by the rich elite. "They helped us a lot," said the country's new police chief and key coup plotter, Joseph Michel Francois, "because we saved them." No evidence of direct U.S. complicity in the coup has arisen, though, as we shall see, the CIA was financing and training all the important elements of the new military regime, and a Haitian official who supported the coup has reported that U.S. intelligence officers were present at military headquarters as the coup was taking place. This was normal, he added, for the CIA and DIA. Defense Intelligence Agency were always there. We have seen in Nicaragua how the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up to do overtly and thus more respectably, Some of what the CIA used to do covertly interfered in the 1990 election process. At the same time, the NED, in conjunction with the Agency for International Development Aid, was busy in Haiti. It gave $189,000 to several civic groups that included the Haitian Center for the Defense of Rights and Freedom, headed by Jean-Jacques Honorat. Shortly after Aristide's ouster, Honorat became the prime minister in the coup government. In a 1993 interview with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, he declared, "The coup was justified by the human rights record of Aristide." Asked what he himself had done as prime minister to halt the massive human rights violations that followed the overthrow, Honorat responded, "I don't have my files here." In the years prior to the coup, the NED also gave more than $500,000 to the Haitian Institute for Research and Development, ERD. This organization played a very partisan role in the 1990 elections when it was allied with U.S. favorite Mark Bazin, former World Bank executive, and helped him create his coalition, just as NED was instrumental in creating the coalition in Nicaragua which defeated the Sandinistas earlier in the year. ERD was led by Leopold Berlanger, who, in 1993, supported the junta's sham election aimed at ratifying the prime ministership of Bazin, Honorat's successor, and a political associate of Berlanger. Another recipient of NED largesse was Radio Soleil, run by the Catholic Church in a manner calculated to not displease the dictatorship of the day. During the 1991 coup, according to the Rev. Hugo Trieste, a former station director, the station refused to air a message from Aristide. The NED has further reduced the U.S. Treasury by grants to the Union Association Federation de Ouvriers Syndics, founded in 1984 with Duvalier's approval, so that Haiti, which previously had crushed union organizing efforts, would qualify for the U.S. Caribbean Basin Initiative economic package. But despite its name and unceasing rhetoric, the National Endowment for Democracy did not give a dollar to any of the grassroots organizations that eventually merged to form Aristide's coalition. Within a week of Aristide's overthrow, the Bush administration began to distance itself from the man, reported the New York Times, by refusing to say that his return to power was a necessary precondition for Washington to feel that democracy has been restored in Haiti. The public rationale given for this attitude was that Aristide's human rights record was questionable, since some business executives, legislators, and other opponents of his had accused him of using mobs to intimidate them and tacitly condoning their violence. Some of Haiti's destitute did carry out acts of violence and arson against the rich, but it's a stretch to blame Aristide, whatever his attitude, given that these were enraged people seeking revenge for a lifetime of extreme oppression against their perceived oppressors, revenge they had long been waiting for. A year later, the Boston Globe could editorialize that the Bush administration's contempt for Haitian democracy has been scandalous. By refusing to acknowledge the carnage taking place in Haiti, the administration has all but bestowed its blessing on the putschists. 2 months earlier, in testimony before Congress, the CIA's leading analyst of Latin American affairs, Brian Littell, had described coup leader Lieutenant Gen. Raul Cedras as one of the most promising group of Haitian leaders to emerge since the Duvalier family dictatorship was overthrown in 1986. He also reported that he saw no evidence of oppressive rule in Haiti. Yet, the State Department Annual Human Rights Report for the same year stated, Haitians suffered frequent human rights abuses throughout 1992, including extrajudicial killings by security forces, disappearances, beatings and other mistreatment of detainees and prisoners, arbitrary arrests and detention, and executive interference with the judicial process. The New York Times one-year post-coup status report was remarkably blunt, since shortly after the overthrow, when Secretary of State James Baker echoed President Bush's famous, "This aggression will not stand" statement about Iraq, little consideration has been given to backing up American principles in Haiti with American muscle. Recently, an advisor of the coup government repeated Father Aristide's longtime complaint when he said that all it would take is one phone call from Washington to send the Army's leadership packing. Supporters and opponents of Father Aristide agree, nothing more threatening than a leaky and ineffective embargo, quickly imposed, has ever been seriously contemplated, which reflects Washington's deep-seated ambivalence about a leftward-tilting nationalist, who often depicted the United States as a citadel of evil and the root of many of his country's problems. Despite much blood on the Army's hands, United States diplomats consider it a vital counterweight to Father Aristide, whose class struggle rhetoric threatened or antagonized traditional power centers at home and abroad. During this period, numerous nocturnal arrivals of U.S. Air Force planes in Port-au-Prince were reported in Haitian clandestine newspapers. Whether this had any connection to the leaking embargo may never be known. When asked, a U.S. embassy official said the flights were routine, the CIA's clients. From the mid-1980s until at least the 1991 coup, key members of Haiti's military and political leadership were on the agency's payroll. These payments were defended by Washington officials and a congressman on the House Intelligence Committee as being a normal and necessary part of gathering intelligence in a foreign country. This argument, which has often been used to defend CIA bribery, ignores the simple reality illustrated repeatedly in this book, that payments bring more than information, they bring influence and control. And when one looks at the anti-democratic and cruelty levels of the Haitian military during its period of being bribes, one has to wonder what the CIA's influence was. Moreover, one has to wonder what the defenders of the payments would have thought upon learning during the Cold War that congressmen and high officials in the White House were on the KGB payroll. Even after the supposed end of the Cold War, we must consider the shocked reaction to the case of CIA officer Aldrich Ames. He was, after all, only accepting money from the KGB for information. In any event, money paid by the CIA to these men, as well as to the groups mentioned below, was obviously available to finance their murderous purposes. When Gaddafi of Libya did this, it was called supporting terrorism. Did the information provided the CIA by the Haitian leaders include advance notice of the coup? No evidence of this has emerged, but 4 decades of known CIA behavior would make it eminently likely. And if so, did the agency do anything to stop it? What did the CIA do with its knowledge of the drug trafficking which the Haitian powers that be, including Baby Doc, were long involved in? 2. In 1986, the CIA created a new organization, the National Intelligence Service, SIN. The unit was staffed solely by officers of the Haitian Army, widely perceived as an unprofessional force with a marked tendency toward corruption. SIN was purportedly created to fight the cocaine trade, though SIN officers themselves engaged in the trafficking, and the trade was aided and abetted by some of the Haitian officials also on the agency payroll. SIN functioned as an instrument of political terror, persecuting and torturing Father Aristide's supporters and other subversives, and using its CIA training and devices to spy on them. In short, much like the intelligence services created by the CIA elsewhere in the world during the previous several decades, including Greece, South Korea, Iran, and Uruguay, and created in Haiti presumably for the same reason, to give the agency a properly trained and equipped and loyal instrument of control. At the same time that SIN was receiving between $500,000 and $1 million a year in equipment, training, and financial support, Congress was withholding about $1.5 million in aid for the Haitian military because of its abuses of human rights. Aristide had tried, without success, to shut SIN down. The CIA told his people that the United States would see to it that the organization was reformed, but that its continued operation was beyond question. Then came the coup. Afterwards, American officials say the CIA cut its ties to SIN. But in 1992, a U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration document described SIN in the present tense as a covert counter-narcotics intelligence unit which often works in unison with the CIA. In September of the same year, work by the DEA in Haiti led to the arrest of a SIN officer on cocaine charges by the Haitian authorities. 3. Amongst the worst violators of human rights in Haiti was the Front for the Advancement and Progress of Haiti, FRAF, actually a front for the army. The paramilitary group spread deep fear amongst the Haitian people with its regular murders, public beatings, arson raids on poor neighborhoods, and mutilation by machete. FRAF's leader, Emmanuel Constant, went on to the CIA payroll in early 1992 and, according to the agency, this relation ended in mid-1994. Whatever truth lies in that claim, the fact is that by October the American embassy in Haiti was openly acknowledging that Constant, now a born-again Democrat, was on its payroll. The FRAF leader says that soon after Aristide's ouster, an officer of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, Colonel Patrick Collins, pushed him to organize a front that could balance the Aristide movement and do intelligence work against it. This resulted in Constant forming what later evolved into FRAF in August 1993. Members of FRAF were working, and perhaps still are, for 2 social service agencies funded by the Agency for International Development, one of which maintains sensitive files on the movements of the Haitian poor. Constant, who has told in detail of having attended, on invitation, the Clinton inauguration balls, was the organizer of the dockside mob that, on October 11, 1993, chased off a ship carrying U.S. military personnel arriving to retrain the Haitian military under the UN agreement, see below. This was while Constant was on the CIA payroll. But that incident may have been something out of the agency's false bottom world. Did Washington really want to challenge the military government, or only appear to do so? Constant actually informed the United States beforehand of what was going to happen, then went on the radio to urge all patriotic Haitians to join the massive demonstrations at the dock. The United States did nothing before or after but allow its ship to turn tail and run. In the summer of 1993, United Nations mediated talks on Governor's Island in New York between Aristide, living in exile in Washington, and the Haitian military government, resulted in an accord whereby the leader of the junta, Gen. Cedras, would step down on October 15th and allow Aristide to return to Haiti as president on October 30th. But the dates came and went without the military fulfilling their promise, meanwhile not pausing in their assaults upon Aristide supporters, including the September murder of a prominent Aristide confidant who was dragged out of church and shot in full view of UN officials, and the assassination a month later of Aristide's Justice Minister, Guy Mallory. Pleased with its foreign policy success in securing the agreement in New York, the Clinton administration seemingly was willing to tolerate any and all outrages. But an advisor to Cedras declared afterward that when the military had agreed to negotiate, the whole thing was a smokescreen. We wanted to get the sanctions lifted. But we never had any intention of really agreeing to Governor's Island, as I'm sure everyone can now figure out for themselves. We were playing for time. Aristide himself never liked the UN plan, which granted amnesty to those who mounted the coup against him. He declared that the United States had pressured him to sign. Speaking to congressmen in early October, CIA official Brian Littell, who had previously praised Cedras and his rule, now characterized Aristide as mentally unbalanced. Was this perhaps amongst the information provided the CIA by their agents in the Haitian military? During the election campaign, Aristide's detractors in Haiti had in fact spread the rumor that he was mentally ill. Littell also testified that Aristide paid little mind to democratic principles and had urged supporters to murder their opponents with a technique called necklacing, in which gasoline-soaked tires are placed around victims' necks and set afire. Neither Littell nor anyone else has provided any evidence of Aristide engaging in an explicit provocation, although this is not to say that necklacing was not carried out as an act of revenge by Haiti's masses, as it was in 1986 following the ouster of Duvalier. At the same time, congressmen were exposed to a document purporting to describe Aristide's medical history, claiming that he had been treated in a mental hospital in Canada in 1980, diagnosed as manic depressive and prescribed large quantities of drugs. This claim was described in the media as emanating from the CIA, but the agency denied this, saying it had seen the document before and had judged it to be a partial or complete fake, but adding that it still stood by its 1992 psychological profile of Aristide, which concluded that the deposed president was possibly unstable.